Okay, I think we're good to go. I think most everybody's here. Good afternoon. I'm Dorothy Guzzo. I'm the Executive Director of the Historic Trust, whose signature you're going to find on all of your official grant documents. Congratulations to everyone out there. Thank you for joining us. Your application was successful, and we were successful in routing it through the legislative process. The governor signed the appropriations bill back in December, so we're good to go with all of these projects. So welcome to the workshop where you're going to learn absolutely everything you will ever need to know about managing your grant projects. We're using a webinar format today. You'll only be able to see the images and the staff person who is doing the talking. We will be reading questions from the Q&A. So as we move along, please put your questions in there. We'll read them out for the benefit of everyone, and we'll be doing it at the end of each section. So by now, next slide, please. I think everybody knows that the Historic Trust is the primary funder of historic preservation in New Jersey. Next slide, please. We're governed by a board of 15, 3 serving in ex officio capacity, and there are 12 public members with experience in historic preservation that are appointed by the governor. Next slide, please. And this is a list of our staff, and you'll see that our staff is growing and that we have some new faces, and all of these people will be needed as we move forward. The Preserve New Jersey Historic Preservation Fund is funded through the corporate business tax dedication that's appropriated to Green Acres Farmland Preservation and to the Historic Trust. And we are anticipating a robust amount of money each year going forward, so the additional staff is desperately needed to keep your projects on track. So at this point, I'd like to turn this over to Sam Siegel so that we can get going with the overview. Again, congratulations and good luck.
Great, thank you so much, Dorothy. Again, my name is Sam Siegel. I'm a program officer here at the Trust. I'm going to give you a quick refresher on our webinar format, run through the workshop agenda, and give you an overview of the grant materials you've received so far. Next slide, please. So you'll see here the agenda for today's virtual workshop. As Dorothy mentioned, you should be able to see and hear the speakers and our presentation, but we cannot see or hear you. We have also disabled the chat function. So you should pose your questions using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen. I will monitor the Q&A throughout the presentation and either respond in writing or assign the question to be answered live by our staff. For everyone's benefit. If you see a question posed by someone else that you'd also like to hear answered, rather than repeating the question, you can upvote this question by clicking on the little thumbs up button next to it. And it will push the question higher in our queue. This will be helpful for us to prioritize your questions, but please rest assured we will get to everyone's questions by the end of the webinar. If you're experiencing technical difficulties, you can also reach out to us in the Q&A. And we'll do our very best to help you, but please keep in mind that we're historians and not IT professionals. Getting back to the agenda, I'll start with an overview summary of your grantee info packet and grant manual materials. Our fiscal officer, Carrie Hogan, will then walk you through the details of executing your grant agreement with the trust. And my colleague Haley will explain how we define the scope of work for your project. Glenn will explain the expectations for administering your active grant, as well as how to close out your grant when the project is complete. And Ashley will discuss the importance of publicity for your project and highlight some great opportunities that we can offer to help you with publicity. And then we'll make sure to answer any remaining Q&A questions before Dorothy comes back to wrap up the workshop. As I mentioned, I'll monitor the Q&A throughout this presentation, and we'll break for relevant questions after each section. Please be sure to keep your questions fairly relevant to the rest of the workshop participants. We want to be respectful of everyone's time here. And please be aware that we may leave your question until the end of the presentation, or if it's a really highly project-specific question, I'll reach out to you and let you know that you should really speak with the specific program officer assigned to your project. Our staff is also always available for your questions after the fact, and we'll make a recording of this presentation available on our website, as well as a PDF of our slide deck. Next slide, please. So here you'll see kind of the Cliff's Notes version of our grant agreement execution process, which my colleagues will explain in more detail throughout the presentation. Step one is to attend our mandatory grantee workshop to learn about the administration requirements for our grants. That is what you're tuned into right this moment. So congratulations that you're already underway in meeting your requirements. The next step will be to submit the supporting documentation in your grantee packet that you received from us a few weeks ago, which I'll explain further in a moment. You will hear this repeated throughout the presentation, but please remember that the grantee packet is not your grant agreement. This is just a submission of the final materials that we need to assemble your grant agreement and get it back out to you for signature. We should receive your grantee packet materials by March 10th at the latest so that we can turn your grant agreement around in a timely fashion. Once we receive all of the required documentation from your packet, we will send you 2 hard copies of your grant agreement certified mail. You will sign both copies of the agreement and send them both back to us. From there, we will review both copies for completeness, and our executive director, Dorothy Guzzo, will sign them. From there, we send them upstairs to DCA's fiscal office, which will conduct their own review and complete the final required signatures. At that point, the grant agreement will be executed and all of our reporting requirements will be in effect. Glenn will cover these requirements later in the presentation. It's very important to note that we cannot process any reimbursement requests for your project until the grant agreement is fully executed. There are a number of other requirements that may need to be met before you're reimbursed. So if you plan on initiating any work for the project before we execute your agreement, you should definitely reach out to your assigned program officer to discuss the specifics of your situation. We had a bit of a mix-up in our communications this year, so if you're unsure who your specific program officer is, you can reach out to our general email or phone number and we can connect you with your assigned PO. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the grantee packet, which we often call your grantee info packet or just your info packet. These packets were emailed to your primary project contact a few weeks ago, along with the invitation for this workshop. So you should all have a PDF copy of this grantee packet, and it should be specific to your project and organization. We need these forms to be submitted in hard copy. So we ask you to please print out the packet in its entirety, fill it out, and submit it to us in the mail. And there'll be instructions included in the packet for how to do that. Carrie will go into more detail about these required documents, but we ask that you please follow our instructions very carefully. As I mentioned, the deadline for the grantee packet materials is Monday, March 10th, and we need to receive hard copies in the mail. Again, the sooner we receive your complete materials, the sooner we can get a grant agreement to you for signature and execution. The other document available to you at this point is the grant manual, which we now offer in a PDF format for ease of use. This manual is a step-by-step guide for every single aspect of administering your grant, beginning with preparing and submitting your grantee packet, all the way to filling out your grant closeout paperwork and submitting your final work products. It also covers any important initial requirements that you may need to meet. So please be sure to keep the grant manual handy throughout the life of the grant, as it should be your go-to resource at every point along the way. That being said, you should never hesitate, excuse me, to reach out to your assigned program officer here at the Trust with any questions or updates that you may have. Next slide, please. Now, we know that keeping track of a saved PDF or even a printed version of your manual can be tricky with turnover in organizations and all sorts of things going on. So we're thrilled to let you know that we have made the entire grant manual available on the Trust's website, njht.org. Our staff has worked really hard for a long time to roll out our new redesign of our entire website. I want to give a shout out to the folks who made that happen. So the new redesigned website is finally live and it's much more intuitive, but I highly encourage you to bookmark our Grantee Resources webpage specifically. So you can find that by navigating to our website, www.njht.org. clicking on the Resources tab at the top, and then clicking on For Grantees. And that's a page that you can bookmark and save for future use. In addition to a PDF of the grant manual in its entirety, the Grantee Resources webpage also includes each of the reference attachments from your manual and includes important items such as copies of your reporting and reimbursement paperwork, a recording of this grantee workshop, and all sorts of other useful documents that you will need to use. So that concludes our overview of the Grantee Resources. Haley, are there any questions in the Q&A that we should address at this point before we launch into the grant agreement section?
Actually, we have no questions in the Q&A at this time, so I think we're good to have Carrie kick us off with executing the grant agreement.
Awesome. Take it away, Carrie.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Carrie Hogan. I work as the fiscal officer and contract administrator for the Historic Trust. You'll notice that the first chapter of your grantee manual discusses how to execute the grant agreement. And as Sam said, let this be your go-to guide to ensure a smooth contract process. Next slide, please. So in your grantee packet are copies of the grant agreement forms that you'll need to submit to the trust to get the grant agreement drafted. The first form that you'll see in the checklist is the checklist itself, which outlines all the required forms. So the checklist and everything on it needs to be completed and returned as part of your initial grant agreement package, again, due March 10th. These documents are not your grant agreement, but they are the forms that we use to create your grant agreement. So the faster you can get these completed and handed off to your PO at the trust, then the faster your grant agreement can be generated for you. The second item on the checklist is the letter of acceptance for your project. This is very straightforward. You read the letter and you sign it in ink. We need an original signature on the letter, and you can check that right off of your list. Next slide, please. Next on the checklist is the information form or the info form. This is part of that info packet that Sam referred to earlier. This info form is critical to creating your grant agreement and needs to be filled out completely. First and foremost, grantees need to register with NJ Start, which is the state's mandatory procurement and payment system. You get a vendor number once you register and create a profile. You need to make sure that you enter your organization's EIN correctly, EIN or tax ID number, and you're also going to want to be sure that the address that you put in your NJ Start profile is correct and accurate. Incorrect information entered into NJ Start will delay your payments of the award. I want to note that most state, county, and municipal entities are already in the state vendor system via their EIN number, and that's because you've likely already been paid by the state at some point. However, it's best to contact NJ Start directly to confirm that your address and contact information are up to date. And you can see that those the phone number and email are up on the screen right now. In particular, as I said, the address for your organization or entity needs to be a current mailing address or PO box for your organization. And it has to be something that you can actually access, where you can accept your grant reimbursement checks safely. Another option that's relatively new to the program, to the NJ Start system, is that you can sign up for automated or ACH payments. These are electronic payments that deposit grant reimbursement funds directly into your organization's bank account from the state. So instead of waiting on a check to come in the mail, once a PO has approved your work and submitted to the fiscal office, your reimbursement money moves automatically to your business account. ACH can make life a lot easier and expedite grant reimbursement payments. If you are already in the NJ Start fiscal system and you want to change your status from receiving checks to ACH, you can also do that by going into your profile, contacting NJ Start Resources directly, contacting the help desk, and making that change in your existing profile. So that's an option too for most especially non-governmental agencies. Next slide, please. Next on the checklist is proof of liability insurance. The grantee must maintain insurance for the entire term of the grant agreement and the full term of an easement if you have one. New Jersey Historic Trust must be named as additionally insured in the lower left-hand corner of that cord liability certificate. So please request that, that our name and address shows up in that little bottom left-hand corner as additionally insured. And also, if you can, request your insurance company to add your project number to the certificate of insurance. That'll help us keep track of everything with accuracy. All grantees must submit certificates of insurance and/or documentation of self-insurance to the trust before the grant agreement document can be created by your PO. Again, this is an item on the checklist, so everything on the checklist has to be to your PO by March 10th in order for the grant agreement to be drafted. This is a relatively easy certification to check off your list, and you can contact your insurance company today and get the certificate in place. Next slide, please. Next is attachment E, the governing body board resolution. Your governing body, city, county, nonprofit, board, or council needs to pass a resolution that identifies by name the individual who's authorized to sign the grant agreement. In other words, the person who is authorized on this attachment E must be the same person who ultimately signs the completed grant agreement. The resolution must have original signatures and be imprinted with a raised government, corporate, or notary seal or stamp. If your board secretary doesn't have an official stamp, that can be a raised seal or an ink stamp, you must take your resolution to a notary for certification. In fact, most non-governmental organizations just go straight to the notary so that there's no question as to whether or not your resolution has been properly certified. This is one of those requirements that can take some time between board meetings. You have a month to get this into us, so my recommendation would be to get this resolution on your board agenda or council meeting, or schedule a board meeting or council meeting so that this resolution can be passed and signed and handed back into your PO by March 10th. Resolutions that are not properly certified will not be accepted, and that will delay your grant agreement. Next slide, please. So next we have attachment G for the statement of adequacy of accounting system. Your CFO or organization's treasurer must review the requirements of the grant agreement, including all state required audits and reporting, and then sign this form. Your CFO or treasurer cannot be the same person who's authorized in the resolution, attachment E, to execute the grant agreement. It has to be two different people. This is just to ensure that there are checks and balances built into the financial oversight of your grant award. Your CFO will also certify your reimbursement requests and sign all payment vouchers. Once you have completed all forms in your grantee packet correctly, then you surface mail the entire packet to your program officer so they can prepare your grant agreement. Once prepared by your PO, as Sam mentioned briefly, 2 copies of the original grant agreement will be sent to you for signature and return. We receive both copies, and Dorothy, the Trust's Executive Director, and then DCA's Fiscal Office will review and sign them as well. Lastly, 1 fully executed agreement will be mailed back to you, and 1 remains with the trust. So you're going to want to make sure that you know where that copy is and take good care of it so that it's somewhere safe and easily accessible. It really is a living document full of useful tools and forms that will help you meet the requirements for reporting and requesting reimbursements from your award. If you have any questions about the required materials that are on the checklist, or otherwise, please contact your program officer directly. Once you have your fully executed original copy of the grant agreement, that's when you can begin requesting reimbursement for project expenses. So again, as it was mentioned earlier, we cannot reimburse you until the grant agreement is fully executed. So can we'll take some questions?
Yeah, we have some great questions here. A couple of questions came in about NJ Start before you addressed them in the presentation, but I think the answers bear repeating for everyone's benefit. The questions essentially are, what is NJ Start? Is it new to this grant round? And how exactly does it help the process?
NJ Start is the state's mandatory procurement and payment system. So you cannot be paid by the state unless you have a profile in NJ Start. It's not new, it's about 7 years old. For those government organizations, like I said, you're probably already in the system under your EIN because you've received a payment at some point from the state. But you can use those resources that were given to you and call or email NJ Start, which is in the Department of Treasury, directly and check on your profile and make sure that it's all accurate and up to date. So that's what it is, and that's what it does. It allows us to pay you. So pretty important, and we can't pay you without an active vendor number.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions about insurance. Can you clarify the address of the trust needed on the COI? Is it the PO box address or the physical address on South Broad Street?
I've seen both addresses listed in there. I don't think that it really matters all that much. So yeah, either one. It doesn't really matter. We would get the mail or information. It would find its way to us either way.
Great. And the other question about insurance is, do you need the certificate of insurance only for the liability insurance or for all of the required types of insurance?
We require liability insurance, and the Accord has specific values on it that have to be met that you'll see in your grant agreement, but it's really just liability. If you have more extensive comprehensive insurance, then my guess is what we typically see from your insurance company is all of that is included on the Accord that they provide, but it's not necessary. We're looking for liability insurance, workers' comp, that kind of thing. So that should be, that will satisfy the state requirement. But if you have questions about that, you can also reach out directly to your insurance company because they're pretty familiar with this kind of stuff and they can tell you exactly what's covered and what they will provide in the Accord.
Great. We have a question about a corporate seal. If you have a corporate seal, then the form does not need to be notified. Is there notarized? Is that correct?
That is correct.
Another question about governing body resolutions. Can the governing body resolution have an electronic signature from the board chair if they are still meeting remotely?
Yeah, so we would accept that in order to get your grant agreement going. However, we will need an original signature with a attested seal from either a notary or somebody eventually. So what we have been doing during COVID, since this has become pretty common, is that you'll have a virtual signature, you'll hand that into your PO along with the other items on the checklist for your grantee packet, but then you'll still have to mail us an original certified copy. So it's tricky. It's really tricky because the rules on that have not changed in terms of what DCA requires, and yet they're being lenient on what's accepted on a temporary basis. So you can do the electronic signing. You can also do like a color scan of a signature, and then we'll accept it as a PDF. But ultimately, it would have to also be hard copy mailed to us for our records.
Thank you. So the last question is about someone who applied with a co-applicant, but I think this question could also be confusing for folks who aren't the owners of their property. The question is, if you applied with a co-applicant, do both groups need a set of the grantee packet, or do they just fill out one?
That's an interesting question.
Might be a Glenn question.
It might be a Glenn question. Glenn?
Well, I think what we've done in the past when there's been a co-applicant is there's one packet from one main organization who will be, for the most part, managing the grant. But just a co-applicant will also be signing the grant agreement. But I don't think we need two separate packages. We haven't gotten that in the past. But you need, that whoever that one organization is submitting needs to make sure they submit all the information. We can't, it's not part here, part there. They should be submitting a complete packet for that organization, but we have not taken 2 separate packets in the past, so.
Thanks, Glenn.
Move on to defining the scope of work.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Haley McAlpine, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about defining the scope of work for your project. Slide, please. Okay, so the scope of work for each of your projects is going to be very specific to your grant-funded project, and it is based off of the scope of work that you submitted with your grant application. We use the attachment D1 form to define and outline that scope of work. Attachment D1 is actually a component of your grant agreement, which, as Carrie explained, is essentially your contract between the trust and your organization for this grant activity. So the D1 is going to contain all of the project specific information in your grant agreement, and it basically outlines exactly what we've agreed to fund. Your program officer will be drafting your D1 in the next few weeks. Some of you may have already received it. So we're going to ask that you take a look at it, review all of the information, and make sure everything looks okay. Once we get your green light and get that info packet back from you, we can go ahead and compile your grant agreement and get it out to you for signature. Slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through all of the components of the D1, and you can see here on your screen, we actually have a screen grab of a sample for you so you can see what it's going to look like. It includes information about your project budget, including your grant award amount. Your grant award is the amount of money that the trust has awarded your organization for this specific grant activity. The first section of that D1 is going to give you a brief history and statement of significance for your resource. And then in the next section, we're going to identify the project review authority. So for all of our historic site management and heritage tourism grants, the New Jersey Historic Trust will be the primary review authority. However, we may be consulting with the Historic Preservation Office on projects that have a large archaeology component. And then finally, we utilize the third section to define the activities that we're funding with this grant. So for example, if you applied to us for funds for a National Register nomination, then there will be a very brief statement there that says something like, this grant will fund a National Register nomination. It's pretty straightforward. Next slide, please. So in addition to the scope information, we also use the D1 to identify your project team. It's important to note that all project consultants have to be approved by trust staff, and proposals and resumes need to be reviewed. They also need to meet all of our professional qualification standards. So for those of you that applied with a consultant in hand, so you had submitted proposals and resumes in your application package, those consultants are considered approved as they were approved as part of the application review process. For those folks who did not have a consultant on board at the time of application, that's no problem at all. You're just going to work closely with your program officer to make sure that your consultant team meets our qualifications. So you will need to be submitting proposals and resumes as you get them to your program officer so that they can sign off on your project team. It's important to note that some of your projects may include other professionals. You may have a large team. It could include folks like graphic designers or heritage tourism consultants. Those folks do have to be approved by the trust staff as well, and they do have to show relevant work experience and history with your type of project. I also wanted to note that we are going to need a copy of a signed agreement or consultant contract on file. We'll need this before we can issue your initial reimbursement. So please keep in mind that you are going to have to provide your program officer with a signed contract with your consultant for this project. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we give a brief narrative statement at the top of the D1 form, but on the second page of the D1, we actually break out your project by activity and line item. So if your project included more than one deliverable, so if we were doing a National Register nomination and a conditions assessment, you would see those items broken out as individual line items with dollar values assigned to them based on the consultant proposals that you submitted. We also actually include copies of those proposals with your D1 as exhibits, and those are going to be included in the grant agreement itself. So in addition to the whole project budget, we also give you your reimbursement amounts in the D1. So all of our historic site management and heritage tourism grants are reimbursed in 2 payments. The initial payment is 80% of your grant award, and the final payment is that remaining 20%. And Glenn will go into this in a little more detail in the next section, but I just wanted to note that we do actually give you those dollar amounts in your D1. These are going to be really helpful for you when you are planning your budget and your cash flow for the next few years for this project. And the final component of your D1 is actually your project schedule. So I have your specific project schedule on the next slide, but before I show it to you, I want to take some time to define what each of these dates means for you and for your project. So this whole schedule is based off of the day that the governor signs the appropriations bill. That was December 21st of 2021. That was the day that our clock officially started ticking in regards to your grant schedule. So that date is known as the agreement commencement date. For most of you, that December 21st date is also going to be the work period commencement date. However, if you started work on your project prior to December 21st of last year, we will ask for the actual start date, and that will be considered the work period commencement date. From there, we have 18 months from the agreement commencement date to execute your grant agreement. That is a good chunk of time. Please don't take 18 months to execute the agreement. It's in your best interest and in ours to open that grant sooner rather than later. So the sooner you get that info packet back to us and sign off on your D1, the sooner we can generate a grant agreement and get it out to you for signature. All work must be completed within 2 years of the grant agreement commencement date. And your agreement is going to expire 3 years after that agreement commencement date. Next slide, please. So as promised, here is the schedule for your specific grant round. Again, that agreement commencement date, our kickoff date is December 21st, 2021. The work period commencement again will likely be the same date. Then we need to have your agreement executed no later than June 21st of 2023. All of your work should be completed by December 21st of 2023. And we do build in 1 year to help close out the grant. Your grant agreement is actually going to expire December 21st of 2024. It's important to note that extensions on these grants are not assumed. You do have to be approved for an extension, and they are only granted in extenuating circumstances. So please work very hard to get your projects done on time. When that grant agreement expires, it could be challenging for you to get an extension. So be mindful of our project schedule for this year. Slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to touch on some programmatic requirements that we have for all of the trust funded projects. First and foremost, all work that the trust funds must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. It is part of your program officer's job to review all of the work product you submit to make sure it does meet the federal standards. Additionally, archaeology should be considered an integral part of your project. We will be asking you to touch on it in nearly all of your funded work products. Even if archaeology isn't a main concern, your document should address at a minimum the potential for archaeology on site. And then I also wanted to note that all preservation plans and historic structures reports funded by the trust must meet the formatting and content requirements laid out in the preparation guide seen on your screen. This was included in the grant application form as well. You were required to submit a checklist. That checklist is actually what we use to review the work product. So it's super important that you and your consultants are familiar with this guidance document and utilize it when drafting your reports. It is linked on our website under the Grantee Resources tab, and you can always reach out to your program officer for a PDF copy if you're not able to locate it on the website. Okay, next slide. Okay, and finally, before I wrap up, I wanted to touch on some New Jersey state requirements that our grantees are required to comply with. Before I dig in, I wanted to note that all of these are laid out in tab 3 of your grant manual. These requirements can be somewhat nuanced and complex, so it's very important that your CFO or your treasurer take some time to review tab 3 and familiarize themselves with our requirements. One of those requirements is the audit requirement. So if your organization receives over $100,000 in state or federal grants in any given fiscal year, you will be required to submit an audit. While none of your New Jersey Historic Trust grants will exceed $100,000, your organization may be receiving grants from other state or federal agencies in the same fiscal year. If those awards combined exceed $100,000, you will be required to submit an audit. So please keep this in mind. And I also want to note that audit costs are not reimbursable expenses. Your organization is going to have to budget for that audit outside of this project. Up next is the affirmative action requirement. So our grantees, their consultants and contractors are required to comply with the state of New Jersey's affirmative action laws. It's especially important that you have the non-discrimination language and policies included in any proposals or contracts you have for your grant-funded projects. Your consultants are going to be required to show proof of compliance to the state contract compliance unit through the Department of Treasury. There are a few different ways that they can demonstrate this compliance, and all of this information is available on our website under the Grantee Resources tab. And again, it's also in the grant manual. If you have specific questions about meeting the affirmative action requirements, please reach out to the state contract compliance unit. They should be able to help your consultant make sure that they're hitting that benchmark. So that was all the information I had for my section. Are there any questions that I can answer before we move on?
So there's a question in here that I think will be better answered at the end of the presentation. So I think we should keep it moving.
Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Glenn Saponis.
Thank you, Haley. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be going over administering an active grant. This is chapter 4 in your grant manual. It includes communicating with the trust, review and approval of trust of work products, quarterly reports and reimbursement requests, both initial and final reimbursement reports and requests for funding, as well as amending the grant agreement. Again, everything I'm about to go over is covered in detail in the grant manual, which you can access through our website. That includes samples of completed reimbursement forms. Next, please. Well, like I said, first thing on top is communication with the trust. We want to hear from you. We're always open if you have any kind of questions, everything from working on your info packet to grant agreement to anything going on with your project. Your program officer is always available for questions. Don't ever hesitate to call or email us. If you just want to tell us what's going on, that's fine. Giving us good news. If there's an upcoming public event perhaps at your site, you want to let us know, or you might want us or a board member there, feel free to reach out to us. But we're always available for any kind of questions. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. As Sam mentioned earlier, I think the emails that went out with the info packets, or even reminding you of this workshop, I think CC'd your program officer. If not, they will reach out to you directly, or as Sam said, reach out to the NJHT email address, and we'll hook you up with your proper program officer. Next, please. So continuing on with communication with the trust, we do encourage you to contact us again whenever, but oftentimes, especially with a planning grant, you'll be reaching out to us with drafts of planning documents that are funded by the grant. Again, sending us contracts with your consultants, again, quarterly reports and reimbursement requests. You'll also be reaching out to us at the time of closeout with final approval of grant funded products and your final reimbursement. Also, if you have not selected a consultant yet, as Haley mentioned, you do need to provide us, the trust, with sufficient documentation on the consultant, to determine if that consultant meets federal qualification standards. You provide a consultant in your application, then you do not have to resubmit that information unless that has changed. Also, invite us to project meetings. With planning grants, we tend not to have as many project meetings as we might with a construction grant. But if you are having project meetings, please invite us, give us proper notification so we could put it on our schedules. We can't make all meetings, but we do try to make those when we can, especially if there's something that's really site specific that you need us to see, whether it's a mock-up of perhaps masonry cleaning, or something was discovered during some sort of investigation that's important to get our input on. Make sure we're on your schedule for those meetings. But regardless, make sure we get copies of meeting minutes. Because again, if we're not able to make those meetings, we want to review those minutes to make sure that, again, things are moving on track, make sure there's no issues, especially regarding Secretary of Interior standards or even reimbursement potential issues with that. So again, make sure we get copies of those meeting minutes. Also, let us know, reach out to us if you are proposing any changes to the proposed scope of work or consultants. Again, you should be working with your program officer throughout this process. So it's not a last minute surprise, but you're working with them. So we could help guide you as if those things do come up. Next, please. So I mentioned one of the things you'll be reaching out to us for is quarterly reports. The report forms are included as part of your grant agreement, but digital versions of those quarterly reports and reimbursement forms are also located on the resource tab of our website, as Sam had pointed out earlier. Quarterly reports are required, obviously 4 times a year, by email if there's no actual reimbursement request, but if there is a reimbursement request, again, that's something we're going to need original ink signatures on. So you'll have to actually put those in the mail. But if it's a simple update, then we could receive those quarterly reports via email. And again, those reports touch on the current status, the project team, updates on work that's being performed or underway, project schedule, and that sort of thing. In addition to supporting the reimbursement request, these reports also help us to determine if the grant project is on track and to understand the current status of the project. As I said, even if there's been little activity or no activity, send us a report just so we know what's going on. Again, make sure that there are no issues that you're encountering. Next, please. So the quarterly report form is the attachment C of your grant agreement. That's the progress report and reimbursement request. Depending on your particular project, the narrative section that we asked for, maybe just a paragraph or 2. The certification section is basically the grant manager signing off that everything included in the progress report is current and up to date and accurate. We suggest that you keep a digital copy of that first quarterly report. That way you could just reuse it as far as updating information, editing that versus then reinventing the wheel. It might make reporting a little bit easier on your part. Again, reports other than reimbursement requests consists of the first 2 pages of that form. And again, if there's a little report and no reimbursement, a quick email just updating us on where things stand, that your consultant's underway or we're near completion, whatever that might be. A quick email update to your program officer is helpful. Again, the manual, the chapter 4 of the grant manual details exactly how to complete that quarterly report with sample narratives and other information that you'll be providing. Next, please. So reimbursement requests with HSM and Heritage Tourism grants, there are 2 reimbursements. And again, this is the second part of your form C1 of your grant agreement. The initial reimbursement is 80% of your grant award. In order to receive that 80%, you need to have your grant agreement fully executed. So again, getting back the info packet, the resolution, all that stuff is important in order for you to get that initial 80% reimbursement. You must also include at that time a signed contract with your consultant if you haven't already done so. And you also have to make at least 1 payment to your consultant. It could just be part of their retainer. It doesn't have to be multiple payments, but we need 1 invoice and proof of payment, whether that's a canceled check, a bank statement, a purchase order, that sort of thing, at least 1 in order to get that initial 80% reimbursement. Payments take, well, like I say, they take at least 2 to 3 weeks after receipt for us to go through it, but recently there's been basically lack of staff up in the DCA fiscal department. So it's been actually taking a little bit longer. So keep that in mind when you do submit a reimbursement, that while we try to address it as quickly as possible because of staffing shortages, that may end up taking a little bit more time. And again, if you are able to utilize the ACH system, that takes a whole step out of the process of Treasury actually having to send you a check. It could be direct deposited. So definitely keep that in mind. So the final 20%, that second reimbursement, will be reimbursed when you close out the grant. And we've approved and accepted all the documents funded by the grant. Your consultants have been fully paid. So keep in mind that your consultants have to be paid 100% before you could get that final 20%. again, from a cash flow standpoint, that might be important, that you can't, make certain payments and then get reimbursed. I mean, it has to be 100% to get that final 20% of your grant. Next slide, please. All reimbursements require a signed state transmittal and payment voucher, as well as the reimbursement form being signed. Both of these documents are signed by your treasurer or CFO. It's that same person, the financial officer that Carrie mentioned, at attachment G, that's part of your info packet. That's the same person who'll be signing both the reimbursement request as well as that state payment voucher. Again, we do need ink signatures on these, so you can't just scan or have a digital copy. We do need original signatures on those 2 pages. In addition to those forms, again, you'll be including whatever invoices and copies of canceled checks or other proof of payment for each of those invoices listed on that ledger sheet that you include in your reimbursement request. And again, payments should correspond with the amounts on the invoices to the canceled checks, and they should be grouped together. Makes it easier for us or quicker for us to process that. If you're an agency of government and you're using purchase orders versus canceled checks and that sort of thing, provide as your proof of payment. They must be completed in full, meaning all the required signatures have to be in place. It's great if you could include the check number and the amount as well on that purchase order. Again, it makes it easier as we're going through and processing to keep those things together. So, all right, next slide, please. So we will be reviewing work products. All work products must meet the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, as Haley mentioned. Again, we're looking at whatever the planning grant or heritage tourism grant is funding. We will need to review those products, whether it's the National Register nomination, the preservation plan, HSR, condition assessment, heritage tourism plan, whatever it is. We need to review drafts of those documents, construction drawings and specifications as well. We highly recommend, a draft perhaps at 80%, just to make sure you're on track. But we will also we will provide comments back to you, and then we'll expect a final version before we close out the grant. We also, as Haley mentioned, we strongly encourage any preservation planning documents to include archaeology, whether it's in part of a preservation plan or something else. Make sure it's being considered. You may not have an archaeological issue right now, but if you move forward with a potential construction project in the future, be aware of what those issues might be now. If there's going to be any ground disturbance, again, it'll help with the planning process when you come to us for a construction grant. All preservation plans and HSRs must comply with the guidelines presented in the preparation guide that Haley mentioned. That's on our website. It's also on HPO's website. This document is available, like I said, on our website, and it's a handy checklist for you to go through to see what we're expecting, what sections are appropriate, whether you're doing a preservation plan, HSR, or amending one of those 2 previous documents. You and your consultant should become familiar with the checklist and the guide. Again, if a section is not applicable to your resource, state that rather than skipping it in your document. Inclusion of all these sections makes for a thorough plan, and the substance of each section is meant to help guide you as stewards of the resource. So the information should be sufficiently detailed and complete to allow you to make informed decisions as you're moving forward, especially if you're anticipating a construction grant in the future. Again, if sections are missing from the draft, we will require that the document be revised to include those sections prior to closing out the grant and prior to you receiving that final 20% of grant funds. Next slide, please. So there are certain times when a grant agreement needs to be amended. We do have that capability within the grant agreement. Again, if the project's not on track, the grant agreement can be amended to allow you the opportunity to complete the project. If there's a change to the schedule for any reason, a change to the scope of work, or a change in the consultant or contractor, you must require that the grant agreement be amended. This request is handled through the attachment D2 of your grant agreement, and simply requires that you explain the reason for the change. Our request, again, if it's a time period type of thing, how much longer you might need. But again, this is going to be reviewed by our Grants and Loans Committee at its quarterly meeting, and then you'll be informed on whether that grant, that change has been accepted or not. And again, talking about schedules, we understand when there are some delays caused by circumstances beyond your control, but to the fullest extent possible, you should, try your best to make sure your project stays on schedule. Because again, as Haley mentioned, getting an extension is not guaranteed. The Trust Grants and Loans Committee will not automatically just grant that extension. It have to be fully justified. And remember, your grant management history is part of future grant application evaluation. So, try to do your best to make sure you don't need an extension and things stay on track. Again, it's 2 years to complete the work, an additional year to close out the grant. So 3 years total. Again, for the most part, should do as far as completing your grant. Next slide, please. All right, so your project's complete. All the work, meets the Secretary of Interior standards, been approved by a program officer at the trust. You manage your grant responsibly. You've kept the trust in the loop with your quarterly reports. You've gotten your initial reimbursement. Everything's been revised and submitted. We've accepted everything. So let's close out your grant. Next slide, please. So up until now, you've been utilizing the C1 progress report and reimbursement form. For closing out the grant, this will be the final reimbursement request. And so that's the C2 form of your grant agreement. And again, in order to close out your grant, all deliverables that was part of your scope of work needs to be submitted and accepted by the trust. For planning documents such as preservation plans, HSRs, condition assessments, we require 2 hard copies as well as 1 digital copy of those plans, because we also share those with the Historic Preservation Office for their library. Again, whatever was in your approved scope of work should be completed by the time you're closing out your grant. The report itself will include a final narrative. Depending on what the grant is for, it might include some pictorial illustrations as well as all finalized financial documentation. So again, with your initial reimbursement request, you supplied, for the most part, 1 invoice, 1 canceled check. Now for the final reimbursement, you're gonna have to supply the remainder of invoices and canceled checks, so it adds up to 100% of what your project costs are. Again, we cannot close out the grant without all those reimbursement invoices and canceled checks. Again, those 2 forms, the transmittal and payment voucher, as well as that certification form on your request, needs to be completed or signed by your CFO or treasurer, your financial officer. Again, original signatures in ink, not scanned and not digital. Instructions and itemized checklists for that closeout is part of that closeout document, that C2 form. So again, if you go through that, and again, check with your grant manual. It goes through and actually provides a sample of the closeout materials, showing you everything from canceled checks to samples of invoices and what's expected as far as filling out that narrative format. So again, once all that's been submitted and approved by your program officer, we can process your final request and get that final 20% back out to you. That ends my section. I see there are a couple of questions, Sam, if you want to go into those.
Most of these questions are about executing the grant agreement, so I think those are best addressed at the end of the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we should keep moving and we'll address these at the end.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. Many of you are still tuned in, so I want to begin by saying thank you for hanging in there. You have received a lot of information this afternoon, and we are in the home stretch now. So once again, my name is Ashley Parker. I am the program officer for Heritage Tourism here at the Trust. And today we'll go over how publicity can play an important role in your project, along with ideas that you can use throughout your project. Next slide, please. Publicity helps maintain visibility of your project and organization during the preservation campaign. It can increase attendance and/or membership for programs and activities, and can also attract new funding support and additional resources. Next slide. Publicizing your project also promotes and raises awareness of history and historic preservation in New Jersey. So this helps ensure ongoing funding for historic preservation. Good publicity opportunities are grant award announcements and check presentations, project milestones such as groundbreaking or ribbon cutting ceremonies, tours, special events, and profiles on your volunteers, staff, or special craftsmen. You may also send a letter to your legislators and representatives, letting them know about your project milestones. If you are interested in coordinating a check presentation or a grant award announcement, please contact your program officer. We have a large check, which you can see here on our screen, and we are very eager to use it. So please invite us to your events. Next slide, please. In addition, your site might also be eligible for inclusion on Journey Through Jersey, the state's go-to website for all things heritage tourism that was launched by the Trust in 2017. The website features heritage tourism destinations throughout the state, in addition to annual events, educational resources, blog posts, and travel itineraries, which are also featured on Journey Through Jersey's Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We highly encourage you to nominate your visitor-ready site. Journey Through Jersey will publicize your resource for free. We only ask that you are a participating resource and that you include the Journey Through Jersey logo with a link to the website on your organization's website. If you would like to learn more about Journey Through Jersey, would like to be featured, or are interested in writing a blog post, please send a message to info@journeythroughjersey.com. Next slide, please. So help us help you promote your project by staying in touch with us. The Trust is active on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We encourage you to tag us in posts, send us news coverage, progress photos, events, or any other content that you would like us to share. There are no guarantees, but we do try to post as much as we can. We also kindly ask that you reshare our posts and link to our website in order to help us raise awareness about funding opportunities and historic preservation in New Jersey. Next slide, please. So I'd like to turn the presentation back over to my colleague, Sam, to address any of those remaining questions that you might have.
Great, thank you so much, Ashley. So we'll launch into what look like the final questions here. If folks have other questions, you shouldn't hesitate to drop them into the Q&A. The first question is about the acceptance letter in the Grantee Packet. Someone asks, please clarify who should sign the acceptance letter that they received from Ms. Guzzo. Glenn, you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, it should be whoever is basically authorized for your organization to sign documents, whether it's again the president or chairperson of your organization, administrator if you're a municipal or county government, but typically whoever's authorized to sign, because you're agreeing to accept this grant basically, and it allows us to move forward.
Great, thank you, Glenn. And if folks are still unsure about that, they can always reach out to their program officer with any specific details. The next question is about the D1 scope of work. They ask, our consultant and their scope of work was approved as part of our application. Can I use the D1 prepared by our program officer as the basis for my contract with my consultant?
So your contract with your consultant should be for the same project that we're agreeing to fund. So typically the contracts are identical to the proposal that was submitted with the grant application unless something is substantially changed. If there are substantive changes, you'll want to reach out to your program officer right away to discuss those to make sure it's still the same project we originally agreed to fund. A lot of times with consultants, they'll just include signature lines right to that same proposal, and that becomes the contract. So that's typically the easiest way to do it. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but the D1 and the proposal and the signed contract are all going to be for the same scope of work. So the language should be the same.
Yeah,
Glenn, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree completely, Haley. That typically is just an added signature line to the proposal. But again, if it is a separate document, sometimes architects will use the AIA of standard forms. Just make sure that everything, and again, check with the program officer, but make sure everything that was in the approved scope of work in your application makes it into your contract, because that's what we're going to be reviewing when we receive documents is what was in that original proposal.
Very good. So we have one more question before our closing remarks. It's about the audit requirement. Is the $100,000 trigger needed for an audit based on the calendar year in which the grant money is received, or based on the year when the grant agreements are formally signed?
I can go ahead and answer that. So yes, the audit is triggered at the $100,000 level, and it is based on how many payments you've received in your fiscal year. So it's about grant funds disbursed. It's not about the grant agreement. And what you'll receive in the mail would be an expenditure form where you can itemize those things, whether it's state alone or state and federal combined that's assisting you. Anything that you get from the state and Fed combined over $100,000 is what triggers the audit.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all my colleagues for answering these questions, and thanks to our participants for all of these great questions. Before I hand it over to Dorothy for her closing remarks, I want to remind everyone that a recording of this workshop and a PDF version of our PowerPoint presentation will be available to you on our website. The requirements for executing your grant agreement should be fresh in your mind in the coming weeks, but the rest of this information may feel at this point a bit like drinking from a fire hose. Thankfully, our Grantee Resources webpage and your PDF grant manual provide excellent resources for every step of this process, but you should never hesitate to reach out to your assigned program officer. We are always here to help with questions large or small. Now, Dorothy, I'll hand it over to you to close the workshop.
Thanks, Sam. And thank you to everybody who hung with us for the duration of this workshop. We're really looking forward to getting these projects off the ground and to working with you to make them come to fruition. I know we've just bombarded you with an awful lot of information, but really it won't be so bad once you get started. So I want to thank you all for attending, and I wish you the best of luck in getting these projects done.